Did you know that at this very moment, your brain is performing one of the most sophisticated tasks it can possibly do? As you listen to English, millions of neurons are working together at incredible speed. Before you consciously understand a sentence, your brain has already identified individual sounds, recognized familiar words, predicted what might come next, connected those words to grammar, and searched your memory for their meaning. All of this happens within a fraction of a second without you even noticing. Perhaps the most fascinating part is that every time you repeat this process, your brain becomes a little more efficient. Learning English doesn't simply add new vocabulary to your memory. It gradually changes the way your brain processes language. For decades, neuroscientists, psychologists, and linguists have been fascinated by one important question. What actually happens inside the human brain when someone becomes bilingual? Is language learning simply a matter of memorizing words and grammar rules? Or does it reshape the brain itself? Thanks to modern brain imaging technologies such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, often called fMRI, researchers can now observe the brain while people listen to, understand, and speak different languages. What they have discovered is remarkable. Learning another language is one of the most demanding cognitive activities the human brain can perform, involving memory, attention, decision-making, sound recognition, and problem-solving all at the same time. For many years, scientists believed that the human brain became relatively fixed after childhood, which led to the widespread belief that adults could never learn languages as successfully as children. Although children certainly have unique advantages, modern neuroscience has shown that this older idea was incomplete. The adult brain remains highly adaptable throughout life because of a property known as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by creating, strengthening, and modifying neural connections in response to new experiences. Every time you practice English, whether you're reading a book, listening to a podcast, speaking with a friend, or simply thinking in English for a few minutes, your brain is reinforcing these connections. Progress may not feel dramatic from one day to the next, but over weeks and months, these small changes accumulate into meaningful improvement. This is one of the reasons why consistency is so much more powerful than intensity. Many learners believe they need to study for several hours every day to become fluent. But research on learning and memory suggests that frequent, repeated practice is often far more effective than occasional marathon study sessions. Every short conversation, every podcast you listen to, every sentence you speak aloud gives your brain another opportunity to strengthen the neural pathways responsible for understanding and producing English. One of the most fascinating discoveries in modern neuroscience is that a bilingual brain is never truly turned off. Even when you're speaking only one language, your other language doesn't completely disappear. For many years, scientists assumed that bilingual people simply switched one language off and another one on, almost like flipping a light switch. However, decades of research have shown that the process is far more complex. Both languages remain active to some degree, and your brain is constantly selecting the words you need while suppressing those you don't. Imagine trying to listen to one person in a crowded room while politely ignoring every other conversation around you. That is similar to what your brain does every time you speak a second language. This ability to choose the correct language relies on a set of mental skills known as executive functions. These include focusing your attention, ignoring distractions, holding information in your working memory, and switching between tasks when necessary. Every time a bilingual person changes from one language to another, the brain performs an incredible balancing act. It activates one language while preventing the other from interfering. Although researchers continue to study exactly how much this experience influences thinking, there is strong evidence that bilingualism provides the brain with regular practice in managing attention and selecting relevant information. In many ways, it's like giving your brain a daily mental workout. One of the scientists most closely associated with this field is psychologist Ellen Bialystok, whose research has transformed the way many people think about bilingualism. Rather than asking whether bilingual people simply know more words, she explored how using two languages might influence broader cognitive abilities. Her studies suggest that the lifelong experience of managing two languages may strengthen certain aspects of attention and cognitive control. At the same time, other researchers have pointed out that these effects are not identical for everyone and may depend on factors such as proficiency, age of acquisition, and how frequently both languages are used. This is an important reminder that science rarely gives simple yes or no answers. Instead, it helps us understand complex patterns that develop over many years. Let's consider a simple example. Imagine that someone asks you, "What did you eat for breakfast?" If you're learning English, your brain immediately begins searching through thousands of words stored in your memory. It has to retrieve the correct vocabulary, organize it into a grammatically correct sentence, pronounce each word accurately, and monitor whether the sentence makes sense, all within a matter of seconds. If your native language also contains the words for bread, coffee, or eggs, your brain has to prevent those words from slipping into the conversation. This entire process happens so quickly that fluent bilingual speakers often don't even notice it. Yet from a neuroscientific perspective, it is one of the most sophisticated cognitive performances humans carry out in everyday life. Another remarkable feature of the bilingual brain is its ability to predict language before it is fully heard. Researchers studying language comprehension have found that the brain is constantly making predictions about what comes next in a sentence. When someone says, "Every morning I drink a cup of," your brain is already expecting words such as coffee or tea before the speaker finishes the sentence. This predictive ability allows us to understand speech much more efficiently. As your English improves, these predictions become faster and more accurate because your brain has encountered similar sentence patterns thousands of times. In other words, fluency is not only about knowing more vocabulary, it is also about becoming better at anticipating language in real time. Memory plays an equally important role in this process. Many learners worry because they forget words after studying them only once. In reality, forgetting is a completely normal feature of human memory. Your brain is constantly deciding which information is worth keeping and which information can safely be discarded. A word that appears only once may seem unimportant, but a word that appears repeatedly in conversations, books, podcasts, and everyday situations gradually becomes more valuable to your brain. This is one reason why researchers recommend encountering vocabulary in many different contexts rather than memorizing isolated word lists. The German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus was among the first scientists to study how memory changes over time. His famous forgetting curve demonstrated that information fades surprisingly quickly if it is never reviewed. Fortunately, later research also showed that each successful review slows down this forgetting process. This discovery eventually led to the development of spaced repetition, one of the most effective learning techniques used today. Instead of reviewing everything every day, spaced repetition schedules reviews just before you're likely to forget the information. Each review strengthens the memory, making it increasingly resistant to forgetting. But memory alone is not enough to become fluent. Retrieval is equally important. This is where active recall comes into play. Rather than reading the same vocabulary list repeatedly, active recall challenges you to produce the information from memory. For example, instead of looking at the word environment and reading its definition again, you close your notebook and try to explain the word in English or use it naturally in a sentence. Although this feels more difficult, it is precisely that mental effort that strengthens the neural pathways responsible for retrieving language during real conversations. In many ways, your brain learns more from remembering than from rereading. This principle explains why speaking practice is so powerful. Every conversation forces your brain to retrieve vocabulary, construct sentences, monitor grammar, adjust pronunciation, and respond to another person, all at the same time. It is a far richer learning experience than simply recognizing words on a page. This doesn't mean reading and listening are unimportant. On the contrary, they provide the input your brain needs. However, speaking transforms passive knowledge into active communication, and that transformation is one of the defining steps on the journey toward bilingualism. The encouraging news is that none of these changes happen overnight, and they don't need to. Your brain wasn't designed to become fluent after a single study session. It was designed to improve gradually through repetition, meaningful practice, and regular exposure. Every podcast you listen to, every article you read, every sentence you speak aloud, and every mistake you correct is another opportunity for your brain to adapt. Over time, these countless small improvements begin to merge together until one day you realize something remarkable. You're no longer translating every sentence in your head. You're beginning to think in English, and your bilingual brain is becoming stronger with every passing day. As you continue learning English, you may begin to notice something that surprises almost every language learner. One day, without consciously trying, you catch yourself thinking in English. Perhaps it's something simple like, "I need to buy some milk," or "It's a beautiful day today." At first, these thoughts appear only occasionally, almost by accident, but over time they become more frequent. And eventually you realize that your brain no longer needs to translate every sentence from your native language. This moment feels almost magical, but neuroscience offers a fascinating explanation for why it happens. When we first begin learning a language, we often rely on translation because our brains already have strong neural pathways for our native language. Every English word has to travel through those existing pathways before we understand its meaning. This process is slow and mentally exhausting. However, with repeated exposure and practice, the brain gradually creates direct connections between English words and their meanings. Instead of hearing the word apple, translating it into your native language, and then imagining the fruit, your brain begins to connect the English word directly with the image, taste, smell, and experience of an apple. This makes understanding much faster and far more natural. Many experienced polyglots encourage learners to stop translating every sentence as early as possible. That doesn't mean forcing yourself to think only in English from the beginning. Instead, it means gradually building direct associations. If you see a chair, simply think chair. If you're drinking coffee, think this coffee is hot. When you're walking outside, describe what you see using the English you already know. These small exercises train your brain to process English independently instead of constantly relying on your first language. At first, your vocabulary will be limited, but that's perfectly normal. As your vocabulary grows, so will the complexity of your thoughts. One of the most effective techniques for strengthening these direct connections is shadowing, a method that has been recommended by language teachers and polyglots for many years. Shadowing involves listening to a native speaker and repeating what you hear. Almost immediately, trying to imitate not only the words, but also the pronunciation, rhythm, stress, and intonation. At first, it can feel overwhelming because native speakers often talk much faster than learners expect. You may miss words or struggle to keep up. However, that's exactly why shadowing is so valuable. It trains your ears, your mouth, and your brain to work together in real time. Instead of thinking about grammar rules, you're learning to recognize natural speech patterns automatically. One important point is that not all practice is equally effective. Passive exposure has value, especially for improving listening comprehension and expanding vocabulary, but active engagement produces deeper learning. Instead of simply watching a video, pause occasionally and summarize what you've understood. Instead of reading an article silently, explain its main idea aloud. Instead of memorizing a list of new words, challenge yourself to use each one in a meaningful sentence. These small changes transform passive learning into active learning, and active learning is far more likely to create lasting memories. Perhaps the most encouraging message from decades of research is that becoming bilingual is not a single moment that suddenly arrives. It is a gradual process made up of thousands of tiny improvements. Every unfamiliar word you understand, every conversation you finish, every podcast you listen to, and every sentence you speak contributes another small piece to the larger picture. Most of these changes are invisible from one day to the next, which is why many learners underestimate their own progress. But if you compare yourself with the person you were 6 months or a year ago, you'll often discover that you've come much farther than you realized. So the next time you sit down to practice English, remember that you're doing much more than preparing for an exam or learning a useful skill. You're challenging one of the most adaptable organs in the human body. You're strengthening connections between billions of neurons, improving your ability to process information, and gradually building a second language that can open doors to new cultures, new friendships, new opportunities, and new ways of thinking. Progress may feel slow today, but your brain is changing with every meaningful interaction you have in English. Keep showing up, stay curious, and trust the process. Your future bilingual self is being built one conversation, one page, and one small habit at a time.